times of heroes, villains played their role so well. Conquered heroes lost in time, while villains waited for their help. Ireland, Ireland, tales were lost in time, now retold without the hype. Her leaders truly shine.
Benach dí agus fáilte chuig an créola seo, scéalta ó na saolta sin. Greetings and welcome to the podcast, Tales from Their Times. This is Neville Ronan. I've written several trilogies covering stories of Ireland's ancient past, right up to the troubled times of the Middle Ages. I'm using this podcast to give voice to the first book of my initial trilogy, which plays out in the Fianna cycle of Irish history from the mid-3rd century. I hope that my pronunciation helps you with people and place names from the book, names that you might otherwise struggle to give voice to. The first of these stories is called Pursuit, and provides a more realistic view of the happenings that revolved around the famous Pursuit of Diarmid and Grania story that most of us Irish grew up with. Pursuit, Chapter 1. This time of year the air had a definite chill to it. When pushed by the wind, it could cut through the heaviest of clothing and leave a person feeling distinctly uncomfortable. Though uncomfortable and tired, they had ridden hard, particularly for the first couple of days. It was important to put as much time and space between themselves and Tara as possible. They both knew that, so they put up with the discomfort that the cold brought. They set themselves a heavy pace, and Diarmid, a young but battle-worn warrior of the Fianna, had no trouble maintaining it. His young companion Grania, though, was definitely saddle-weary, and he saw it on her face that she needed a rest. They had reached Alluin already, so he felt pretty good about the progress made and distance covered, so he decided it might be worth a stop here before continuing further, and began looking for a safe place to stop and rest. Alluin was a small village on the River Shannon in the middle of the Irish countryside. Its main purpose in life seemed to be the ford that allowed crossing of an otherwise deep and treacherous river. "Let's get across to the other side, and then look for a place to stop a bit, away from the river, if that's okay," he said to his companion, and she nodded in compliance. As she stepped into the waters at the ford, he asked her to wait for him a moment before going any further. He had her dismount, and then he took the reins of her horse. He rode both horses along the muddy stretch on the near side of the river, and continued until he reached a small wooded stretch south of them by about a half-mile. Then he broke saplings and small branches of trees to make it look like they had ridden through the woods in a southerly direction. He lit a small fire by the river's edge and made a bit of a mess in the surrounding grass. Then he walked both horses into the river at that point and made it look like they were travelling south. Once the diversion was finished, he doubled back within shallow waters of the riverbank until he arrived to where he had left Grania. She watched as he dismounted, walked over to the bank, and drew rough markings in the mud near his entry point. He made it look like they had stopped and figured out their directions at this location, ultimately heading south to where he had gone with both horses. Once Grania and he had remounted and crossed the ford, they stayed within the low waters of the river's edge for about a quarter-mile in a northerly direction, before returning to land and heading on their true course in a westerly direction. He was noted for his irresistibility to women, and yet his 6-foot frame and muscular build made Diarmid the epitome of a warrior in Grania's mind. As she watched his efforts, she thought to herself how his beauty and beguile seemed so irrelevant as compared to his true qualities, and dismissed the general swooning that this beauty provoked as being immature and crass. In his mind, he was convinced that it would be a tough trail to follow. But Fianna scouts were very adept at finding the slightest of clues, so Diarmid knew that his ruse would likely only confuse them for a while. But as he explained to Grania, each few hours we increased the gap by could well be the difference between life and death. Once they cleared that wooded area, they continued almost due north until by nightfall they finally rested at a stone circle near Lisconnor. They fed and rested their horses, and using their cloaks as beds, then lay against the largest of the stones. "Another day's ride and we'll be at Benbulben," Diarmid said. "When we get there, we'll be able to rest in safety and come up with some more definitive plans. I spent some time here as a boy with my uncle, but know that the King of Connacht is no friend of ours, and we will need to keep a low profile," he added. Grania didn't say much. Though she had caused this escape, she did so without a real plan of her own, and thus far everything that Diarmid did seemed to have a purpose, so she was happy to just go along with everything he proposed. She was, as her name implies, beautiful. She was every father's lovely daughter that needed to be protected from the threatening eyes of would-be suitors. Her long dark hair was held in a braid, allowing her penetrating eyes and full lips to dominate her otherwise soft and gentle face. Her regal presence seemed much more than the jewellery that adorned her neck, head and hands. It was very much contained within the way she held herself. The fact that she also stood taller than most women in her immediate circle played to her regal stature, and yet her curved figure bore witness to the notion that here stood a woman every bit as physically capable as most men. Right now, though, she hadn't eaten in over 24 hours, and she was definitely hungry. As if reading her mind, Diarmid offered her some bread from his saddle, and she happily accepted. He watched as she ate and wondered to himself how he had gotten into such a mess, and how on earth he was going to get out of it. Grania went to sleep soon after eating, but Diarmid's mind was too active just yet, so he sat semi-upright at the stone, just staring off into the almost clear skies. The partial moon above them shed enough light for him to make out the full circle of stones, and his mind wandered onto how many others might have spent time here this past couple of thousand years. There was a certain reverence given by all Irish warriors to stone circles. They were generally at least 2,000 years old by this time, and were a reminder of an ancient peoples that inhabited this isle before the Celts arrived. Most of these people were long gone by now, but of course there was still some presence of the Tuatha Dé hereabouts. For their part, Celts attributed much of the magic and godlike behaviours to those that lived in the mountains and underground at this point in time. Diarmid was lost in a thought of whether this might have been a circle of these people when something caught his eye just beyond the far side of the circle. It was a movement barely discernible in this light, but Diarmid could tell straight away that it was men on mounts. He reached across to Grania, who was only minutes into her sleep, and with hand over her mouth woke her up. "Riders," he whispered, and took her around the back of the stone they had been resting at. Moments later, 4 men on horses entered the circle. They were soldiers of the provincial king's army, and decided to rest here for the night while on patrol. They didn't immediately notice the spot where Diarmid and Grania had been sleeping, and they also hadn't made out the horses tied to the old oak tree just outside the circle, nor the strangers hiding behind the nearby stone. At this moment, Grania couldn't tell whether these were Fianna or men of Connacht, and she fought to contain her anxiousness. Diarmid could tell from the dress of the men that they were the latter, but, as he said to her earlier, this didn't really present that much less danger to them anyway. The men began to talk among themselves, and a couple of them had already started taking their bedding from backs of horses, when one finally noticed the horses tied to the tree. He drew his sword and walked towards the horses until finally Diarmid stepped in front of him with his sword drawn and ready to engage. "Fianna!" the Connacht man shouted and launched himself at Diarmid. At the first clash of steel on steel, the other 3 also ran over, swords drawn and ready to engage. Diarmid had already felled the first one, as the other 3 in unison began to swing and lunge wildly at him, but within 2 or 3 minutes they too lay on the ground beside the first. Diarmid wiped off the blood on the cloak of one, and then sheathed his sword. Other than a small tear to his cloak, there was no evidence he had even been in a fight. This was the first time Grania had seen Diarmid in a fight, and she experienced such a confused feeling of fear, anxiety, pride, and safety as she hugged into him. He returned her embrace and told her that everything is fine, but we just can't stay here tonight. He explained that the fact that they were on patrol meant that it was unlikely that others would be out this way anytime soon. But the smell of dead bodies would attract wolves, and they couldn't light a fire to get rid of the bodies, as it would give away their location to others. So they mounted up again and rode still further north for a couple of hours until they came across an abandoned stone hut and bedded down there for the night. While it didn't have a roof over their heads, the 4 narrow walls gave them some sense of home and security, and it wasn't long before Grania was back asleep. This time she was hugged into the side of Diarmid. He, on the other hand, slept mostly in a seated position, and he eventually drifted into such a light sleep that he was likely to wake at the sound of a leaf falling. Daybreak came a little too early for the travellers, and both Diarmid and Grania sluggishly set about getting the horses ready for another day's riding. They rode in a northerly direction for several hours, stopping only once to give the horses a little rest and to steal some apples from an unattended orchard. It was late afternoon when they reached the River Boyle, crossing just south of Lough Key. It was a narrow but deep river in parts, and if they crossed here they had every chance of making Benbulben before darkness fell. Diarmid remembered this little section of river from where he was on a visit many years ago. "It's good fishing around here," he said. "Fionn O'Sheen and I spent a week here a few years back, and the salmon were plentiful. Let's take a short break and see if we can catch tonight's supper." So while Grania dismounted and sat on the bank, Diarmid stepped a few feet into the moving waters and cast a line with a hook. Beyond its practical purpose, it gave him the chance to pause and breathe in the moment. The river was fast flowing, but there was a large pool that was protected from the current and looked deep enough to be hiding a fish or two. He wasn't yet fully lost in thought when somewhere downstream he heard a weak call. He turned to Grania and asked, "Did you hear that?" She listened and then said, "No, I didn't hear anything." He listened for a few minutes, but there was nothing further, and he thought he must have imagined the cry. But then he heard it again. It was a faint cry of help from a female voice coming from some distance downstream. He rushed out of the water, placing the end of the fishing line in Grania's hands, and told her he would be back. She still heard nothing, but held the line as he got on his horse and rode downstream a distance, ultimately disappearing from view. When Diarmid reached a bend in the river a little further downstream, he stopped and saw the commotion. There was an old lady crossing the river in a horse-drawn wagon, and it looked like a wheel had gotten stuck in the riverbed. She was trying to get the horse to pull the wagon free, but the horse was struggling with both the weight of the wagon and the quick current of the river itself. Just as he arrived at the bank, the harness on the horse came free from the wagon, and the old lady was pulled from the wagon into the water. Diarmid rode quickly into where she was splashing around and lifted her back onto the wagon. As he did so, he could see that her horse was now clearly in trouble with the river current, which seemed to gather pace just beyond where they were. Without a word, he jumped into the water and swam to the panicking horse. On reaching the horse, he freed a tangled rein that was threatening to pull the horse's head underwater, and the horse began to calm. Diarmid then took the reins and manoeuvred the horse out of the quickening current and into the calm waters near the opposite bank. Once he had the horse safely on the opposite bank, he returned to where the old lady sat with her wagon in the middle of the rushing waters. He swam over to the wagon, and once he determined that the lady was okay, dived beneath the surface of the water to see what was trapping the wheel. It was quite a stony riverbed beneath the wagon, and sure enough, a large rock had lodged itself right in front of the wheel. This wagon was going nowhere. Without much exertion, he removed the rock, and the wagon was free to move forward again. Then he returned to his horse, and aided by a length of rope and a stout tree trunk on the opposite bank, he was able to successfully get the wagon across to the other side. Though soaked through, the old woman was delighted, and was heaping praise on him for his strength. The strength of noble youth, as she called it. The wheel had come loose in all the efforts against the rock, but there were some tools in the back of the wagon that he was able to use to tighten it back into place on the axle. He wrapped her in his cloak, reattached the harness to the horse and wagon, and asked her to wait there for his return as he went to get Grania. They would see her home safely. When he got back to Grania, she was grinning in accomplishment and held not one but 2 salmon up for him to see. "Supper is secured," she told him. He explained what had happened to the old lady, and how they would make sure she got home safely before continuing on to Benbulben, and she was fine with that. They reached the lady with her wagon again, just minutes later, and though thickly wrapped in Diarmid's cloak, Grania could see that this was indeed a frail old lady in need of care. It was less than an hour later when they reached an overgrown cottage just on the edge of a small forest, and the old lady announced that this was her home. It was a lovely little cottage, but there were a few things that definitely were in need of repair, so it was clear to Diarmid that she lived alone. Grania helped her inside, and Diarmid tended to the horses. He noticed a section of fencing looking particularly rickety, and set about fixing and tightening a few things while he was there. When Grania had the old lady dry and in warm clothes, she offered to cook the salmon so that they could share a warm supper, and the old lady was thrilled. "I'm not normally accustomed to such wonderful company," she said, and when she noticed the work Diarmid was doing outside, she thanked Grania for their kindness. Diarmid made short work of fixing everything he could see that needed fixing, and the three of them sat down to a feast of fresh river salmon that all agreed was fit for a king. While they ate, Diarmid explained how they were on the run and why. They found a sympathetic ear in how their host listened. She explained to them that it was years since her husband died, and then she began to wander on about how wonderful a man he was and how much she had missed him. There was love and sadness in the lady's eyes, and when she began to expand on what an amazing warrior her husband had been, Diarmid listened attentively and gave each word its deserved weight. Above the fireplace was her husband's sword, shield and helmet, and she asked Diarmid to take them down for her. When he brought them to the table, she asked him to take them in thanks for what he had done for her this day. After several refusals, he eventually agreed to take her husband's shield. It was a heavy and strong piece of armour with a magnificent wolf design on the front. She explained that her husband had been called the Wolf when he was a young man, and they had the shield crafted in this way. She suggested that they spend the night at the cottage, as it was now unlikely that they would make Ben Bulben before nightfall in any event. Though it's a humble place for such a couple as you to spend a night, she said. It might give you more peace than a night under the stars. Grania indicated that she would like that, and so it was agreed. Grania's reasoning later to Diarmid was that it would give the old lady some much-needed company anyway. They bedded down near the fire for the night and both slept soundly. It was just as the sun began to define the horizon that Diarmid opened his eyes. Though it was still the grainy darkness that lingers at twilight, he immediately spotted some differences around them. He pushed Grania, who was still mid-dream, beside him, and they both stood up straight. There was no fire in the fireplace, there was no roof overhead. Though they were indeed in the little cottage, it was an overgrown ruin that clearly hadn't been lived in for many years. There was no little old lady and no horse and no wagon outside. There wasn't even a door between inside and outside. In fact, the only remnant of the evening prior seemed to be the shield that the lady had given him. It was the only connection that made last night's events more than just a dream. They each picked up their belongings and went to their horses. They were where they had left them, and the improvements that Diarmid made the evening before were still there. Fences were fixed, obstructions were cleared, but the place was clearly a ruin. Diarmid tied the shield to the cloak over the back of his horse, and they rode away as the sun began to break the horizon behind them. They skirted the edge of the forest, and as they rounded a bend, Diarmid took one last look over his shoulder at the little old ruin sitting in the distance. He gently patted the shield, snapped at the reins, and they picked up their gallop onwards to Ben Bulben. Not a word was spoken. There was no need to. They both knew that they had spent the night in the company of a gentle old soul, and beyond that they needed no further explanation. Chapter 2. The rolling hills of the lower counties gave way to a mountain range that seemed to burst through the green landscape. The horizon was suddenly dominated by swathes of rich browns that contrasted vividly against the green surrounds and the deep blue skies. The riders continued to ride west to where the range came to an abrupt end in the form of a particularly large formation called Ben Bulben. Ben Bulben was a large limestone mountain formed by the Ice Age, and it sits as a huge plateau that dominates the sky north of Schligach. At 1,700 feet, it had enough height from which to see for miles around, and that's one of the reasons Diarmid thought it ideal, while he and Grania decided how best to plan out their next step on this journey. He had spent time there as a boy and had particular memories of a large cave about 300 feet below the top of the mountain. It was around midday when they reached the initial approach to where the cave entrance looked down on them, and they dismounted there. This approach to the cave would be too steep for horses, so Diarmid had picked out a safe location where they could secure them, and yet still be able to see them from the cave. It was a bit of a climb, so all they really took in this first instance was their cloaks, his sword and shield, and some food and water supplies that would get them through the first evening there. Grania had never been in a cave before, so this was an entirely new experience for her. At the front of the cave, the opening was expansive, and other than just outside where there was a small balcony-type rock formation, the view was completely unobstructed. In many ways, if there wasn't a pursuit in progress, this could be an idyllic precipice from which to launch some grand adventure. The cave cut some distance into the mountain, but it was difficult to tell how deep. There were narrow crevices that seemed to travel further from the main cave into caves beyond, but they weren't here to explore. Daylight really only managed to make it about 100 feet into the cave anyway, so this determined the real boundary for what their planned home was to be. After they caught their breath, they finally began to talk about what their plans might be. Diarmid had refused Gráinne's attempts to discuss things to this point, as from the outset he was very much the reluctant partner to this arrangement. He did not appreciate being put in this situation, and he let her know that at every opportunity. But now he was ready to talk. "If we can stay here a few days until the trail behind us grows cold," he said, "then we might be able to gain some real-time advantage over Fionn and his Fianna." His ultimate plan, he had already explained to her, was to get them as far as his father's house in Dangan, down on the Dingle Peninsula. There he would ask his father's advice on how best to navigate through these troubled waters that Gráinne had created for them. He didn't want to head directly to Dangan because he guessed that's where Fionn would imagine they might immediately run to. Heading northwest to this cave as opposed to southwest to Dangan would hopefully throw off his pursuers, he thought. Diarmid began to work on a map. He always kept a map within the fold of a cloak, and now he began to mark it up with routes and locations that they should be able to use on their eventual way south. Gráinne, for her part, was exploring the cave a little. She wanted to find out if there was another exit that they could use if they needed to in an emergency, but she didn't find anything. The way in was the only way out. Giving up on her explorations, she spread her cloak on the ground about 10 feet inside the entrance to the right and decided to get some rest. From there she could keep one eye on Diarmid, who was working on his map in the brighter light closer to the entrance. It might have been an hour later when a lone wolf arrived at the entrance to the cave and stopped about 20 feet from Diarmid. Diarmid noticed him straight away and began to back slowly into the cave. He gave Gráinne a nudge and woke her. She immediately saw the wolf and sat upright. Diarmid slowly eased past her to where his sword and shield was, and as he did so, several more wolves arrived at the entrance. By the time he had his sword and shield in hand and was backed by Gráinne's side, there were at least 20 wolves now across the entrance. Low growling broke the silence, and the wolves began to move in unison towards the couple, who had retreated very much back to the wall on the right side of the cave. At that stage, the largest of the wolves came through the pack, and with a heightened growling stepped even closer to the couple. At the point where a charge appeared imminent, Diarmid pulled his shield to the front of them and raised his sword threateningly above his head. Silence. All growling stopped. The leader of the pack came over and sniffed at the shield, and then lay down in front of Diarmid as though he were a hound. "It's the shield," Gráinne spoke. "They recognize the shield, look." Each of the wolves dutifully lay down, and the moment had passed. Diarmid returned his sword to its sheath, and then laid his shield down on the ground, face up in front of the pack leader. He then touched the wolf's head, and the wolf got to his feet and walked back to the others. Moving as a group, they returned to the entrance, and then lay down again, this time facing to the outside and away from Diarmid and Gráinne. "The old lady. She's looking out for us, Diarmid," Gráinne said. Over the next few days, each morning the wolf pack would leave, and then later in the afternoon they would come back. On each return, those who came back would set themselves up as watch at the cave entrance, so that they were ready to alarm if they spotted something. Each day, Diarmid would make his way out of the cave to where the horses were tied and would tend to them with food and water. And each time he did that, 2 wolves would follow at his heels to make sure he was okay. On the 3rd day, just an hour or so before darkness, Diarmid heard a low growling from the front of the cave. One of the wolves had spotted a rider coming towards the base of the mountain. It was a Fianna scout, and he had picked up Diarmid and Gráinne's trail from the old cottage ruins. Before he came across the horses that were tied up near a wooded recess at the base of the mountain, he was set upon by a pack of wolves who seemed to appear from nowhere. He just managed to get away unscathed, and as he galloped back in the direction he had come from, Ben Bulben behind him steadily disappeared from view. The leader of the pack returned to Diarmid and once again lay down in front of him. At that point, Diarmid realised that the cave had served its purpose, but now it was time to leave. So Gráinne and he pulled together their few belongings and headed down the slope again to where the horses were. They were initially followed by the pack for a distance, and as they rode away in a southward direction, leaving them behind, the howl of a lone wolf filled the air behind them. Fionn stood there with his gaze fixed on the still waters of Loch Derg. It had been a while since his travels had taken him to the southwest, and he stopped to take in the beauty of the Clare Hills as they swept down to the lakeside shores. Born Demna, Fionn was the golden-haired child, hence the name change, growing up, and had retained much of his youthful good looks. Though his face had become chiselled, and his frame bore the scars of battle, he came across as much more youthful than his years. His broad chest, bare from the right shoulder, proudly displayed the scar of a near-fatal wound that must have missed his heart by mere inches. But it was his eyes that mostly caught attention, deep blue and penetrating, and always seemed to be engaging in processing something. As he stood there by the lake, it was now a quiet September morning. The sun was just breaking over the Tipperary Mountains on the other side of the lake, and a warm glow was beginning to overtake the chill of the long night. Some rustling of leaves broke his concentration, and he looked over his shoulder at the figure appearing from the trees behind him. "Fionn, are you all right?" It was Caoilte. He walked towards Fionn, sword still drawn, and a concerned look across his face. Fionn relaxed. Caoilte's presence was calming for him, and he breathed deeply into the morning air. Caoilte returned his sword to its sheath as he drew close to Fionn and saw that his leader was fine. The fastest runner in Ireland, Caoilte was tall and slender, with long flowing dark brown hair that ended midway down his shoulder blades. Though serious beyond his years, he had a smile that could light up any room, and his deep blue eyes made him the target of many a lonely heart. But even when the opportunities arose, and they often did, he chose to remain celibate, as he felt his inability to commit to any woman meant that he should also refrain from using them physically. In any event, his main love was the Fianna, and to his leader and uncle he maintained an undying allegiance that was without qualification. So despite having a deep friendship since childhood with Diarmid, the fact that Fionn felt aggrieved at Diarmid's betrayal was enough to carry Caoilte with him in his quest for satisfaction. They had been together now for almost 15 years as soldiers in arms, and for 10 years before that in Caoilte's youth, when he took every chance for him to be by his uncle's side. Much of his knowledge and tales of valour and heroics had come from the lips of Fionn, and Caoilte felt that he owed so much in life to the man that now stood before him. In fact, Fionn had always treated him more as a son than a nephew. When Fionn's brother Ronan was killed in a skirmish at Grange, Fionn took the boy in and trained him in the art of combat. Caoilte needed little guidance, Fionn remembered. He was a natural athlete and eager to learn. "I couldn't sleep," Fionn replied, as Caoilte drew close. He continued as if they had already been in some established conversation. "I just don't understand how he could take her from me. I never once wronged him, and he knows that I've been without the love of a woman since Sive was taken from me so many years ago. Grania should be mine." Caoilte shook his head in complete agreement with Fionn. "I know, Fionn, I know. We'll get her back." He looked at Fionn, and to him he saw a strong and valiant man in his late 40s. He saw him as a man who was still every bit a warrior of considerable demeanour. From his handsome looks and muscle-bound frame, he looked every bit the warrior that Caoilte knew him to be. But in the back of his mind, Caoilte understood how Grania, barely now in her 20s, could shy from Fionn as a lover and a husband. Caoilte was closer to her age than Fionn's, and closer still to Diarmid, the object of Fionn's dismay. Fionn was more the age of her father. "They are young, uncle, and driven by foolish emotions," he continued. "We must be closing in on them. Sure, Oisín got word this very night that they are camped by the Blackwater, just outside of Limnock." Fionn smiled, not a happy smile, but one that was simply a sign of relief that his search was perhaps coming to an end. "Then let's wake the others and eat. Morning rises as we speak." Fionn put his arm around Caoilte's shoulders, and they turned and walked back through the trees and towards the camp where the others were. As they reached the hollow where the others slept, the embers of last night's fire were still glowing. Around the fire were the sleeping figures of the remainder of the Fiann. Oisín, Fionn's son, Gall MacMorna, leader of the MacMorna clan, Ilbroch, son of Dunling, king of Leinster. Then there was Moelkin, Gall's brother, who had just been newly elected to the elite Fiann to replace the out-of-favour Diarmid. A short distance away was a sprinkling of overnight fires, and there lay the main body of the Fianna army. The Fianna, which was the High King's warrior army, consisted of just about 100 warriors that excelled above all others in order to be considered for such a prestigious army. Currently, 20 or so of these belonged to the Clan Morna, a rival family to Fionn's Clan Buishkna, but were now sworn loyal to the High King under Fionn's command. Fionn and Caoilte emerged into the clearing just as the sun began to clear the mountains and seep through the green and gold foliage of the autumnal trees. "Rise up, Fianna!" Fionn shouted, and immediately the ground in front of him began to come alive with the moving forms of strong men getting to their feet. Caoilte went to the fire and threw on some bramble and sticks that lay nearby. As the fire took life once again, stragglers got to their feet, horses neighed in restless unease. Within the hour, the Fianna had broken camp and were riding across the open fields that accompanied the River Shannon on its path into Limnach. As they arrived at Áp Rowan, a passable ford across the Shannon, Fionn called the group to a halt. He told Gowl to take Maelchan and others of the Morna clan and to cross the river and approach Limnach from the other bank. "We'll see you at Blackwater Falls," he cried out as Gowl and his men began their crossing. "See you there," Gowl responded and waved his men on. The same age as Fionn's father, Gowl wore the heavy scars of his years in battle on his weather-beaten face and body. Though in his late 50s, his body rippled with muscles interrupted only by the scars of knives and daggers that had wounded but not killed him. His left eye was merely a memory, and a leather patch served to hide the disfiguration that would have otherwise taken from this good-looking man. His shaven head and heavy tattoos only helped to give him a fiercer demeanour than his tall and imposing body already demanded. Though all the tattoos were tribal, only the one on the left side of his face actually meant something significant. It was the last tattoo that his father had worn before his death many years before. Within minutes, the dense river foliage had separated the two groups from each other's view, and Gowl pulled his men to a halt. "Maelchan," Gowl spoke softly to his brother, "take Manor, and speed ahead to Diarmid. Let him know that we are just minutes behind, and that he must make an immediate escape." Maelchan nodded, and without saying a word, he and Manor raced ahead at full speed in the direction of Limnach. Gowl and the remainder of his men resumed their progress, but held fast to the reins so that Maelchan and Manor might have as large a lead as possible. Meanwhile, on the other side of the river, Fionn and the remainder of the Fianna continued at a steady pace, only slowing down occasionally to let their horses catch breath. Fionn rode at the lead with Oisin to his left and Caoilte and Ilbrook to his right. The body of the Fianna followed in a column that stretched back a couple 100 yards. "Father," Oisin called out, "what will we do when we catch them? We won't execute anyone, right?" Fionn looked at Oisin and then back at Caoilte. "We will leave judgment to Cormac," he said. "Diarmid has broken his oath to him, so he will decide their fate. Grania will be mine, for I know that she's been put under the spell of Diarmid's good looks. Once away from him, she'll return to her senses." Diarmid's looks were well known throughout Ireland, and it was said no maiden could look on his face and not fall in love with him. Legends exaggerate, of course, but he was a very good-looking young man, no doubt, and Fionn felt confident that once taken out of the mix of possibilities for Grania, that her head would become unturned, and she would follow her father's wishes. "And what of Gowl?" Oisin asked. "I'm not sure he rides with us, father. He bears no love for our clan, and doesn't the Clan Morna have a relation with Diarmid's family?" Oisin was not the youngest in years within the Fianna, but living in the shadow of a father so great, he was definitely the youngest in the ways of the world. The apple of his father's eye, his shoulder-length blonde hair framed the face such that he looked merely a younger reflection of his father. He was a couple of inches taller, leaner, and an unblemished body showed no scars or tattoos. In every way, he was the poster child of the Fianna. "Gowl has sworn loyalty to Cormac, and we will give him benefit of any doubt in such matters," Fionn responded. "Remember, son, Cormac gave Grania to be my wife, and Gowl knows that Diarmid's treachery is as much an affront to our High King as myself." "I'll keep an eye on him nonetheless," Caoilte interjected. "Don't worry, Oisin, I don't trust him either. When it comes to him, my trust is earned, not given." The thunderous hooves continued their path, and soon the Clare Hills faded from view behind them. Meanwhile, some miles ahead and near the small falls of the Blackwater as it swept into the Shannon, Diarmid lay awake. He was listening to the early morning sounds, birds waking to the first light and the soft rush of the nearby Blackwater River as its shallow waters bubbled across smooth stones and pebbles that formed the riverbed. Dawn had broken, but he still hadn't moved from his blanket. Last night's fire still had some smoking embers, and he followed the smoke with his eyes up to the early morning sky. Through the smoke, his eyes alighted on the face of the sleeping Grania. There was little doubt she was a real beauty, and he studied her as she slept just feet from him. The early rays of the morning sun began to flit across her face. Her dark brown hair caressed her face with gentle wisps, and her full lips lay slightly parted as she continued her restful sleep. For Diarmid, though, sleep had been anything but restful. These past months, each innocent noise of nearby night creatures brought anxious thoughts that they might have been stumbled upon or caught. He knew eventually he would be caught, for Fionn, if anything, was relentless in pursuit and could outmaneuver the most evasive of prey. These past 7 years, Diarmid had been part of the Fiann, and so he sensed the inevitable ending at every turn and with every waking moment. The only thoughts that he harboured for reprieve was if Cormac, Gráinne's father, reversed his decision and commanded Fionn to call off the chase. Perhaps Cormac might worry about the danger this pursuit is placing her in, but Diarmid knew that even then Fionn was unlikely to forego his pound of flesh. There was a price to pay, and Diarmid knew that with certainty. And so as he lay there with Gráinne close by, his thoughts drifted back to the fateful evening when his life took this dramatic twist. Chapter 3. Fionn and the Fianna had just returned to Tara from a resounding victory over the Norse invaders at Loch Garman, where the defeated intruders were routed and driven back to sea with only a fraction of the number they had landed with. Together with King Dunling and his Leinster army, they had overcome the invaders in a single day of fighting and with minimal losses, so the mood was high throughout the kingdom. Leinster was one of 4 provincial armies, each under control of their own king. The High King at Tara, Cormac, didn't have a large standing army as such, but had his private guard and the Fianna under his direct rule. On his command, the Fianna would be sent to any province under attack in order to lead the response to whatever trouble was happening. In this instance, Fionn, together with a couple of hundred of his men, marshalled Leinster's response to an invasion attempt in the southeast corner of the country, and now that they had successfully repelled the invaders, they returned victorious to Tara to Cormac's command. Cormac, in celebration, called Fionn and his Fiann to dine with him at Tara, where a feast of wild boar and deer was laid out in sumptuous fashion. As elite as the Fianna was, the most elite were in Fionn's inner circle called the Fiann. To become a member of the Fiann in the first place, a warrior had to prove himself to be the best in the country at a particular skill. Recognition of that skill by Fionn would possibly lead to an invite to join the Fianna. Once within the Fianna, promotion to the Fiann was normally reserved for excellence in service or achievement in battle. Fionn's son Oisin may have had an outward appearance of nepotism attached to his selection, but his bravery in combat and single-handed defeat of the Norse leader in Loch Garman had recently earned him a seat at this table. Caoilte, as the chief storyteller within the Fianna, and in recognition of having saved Fionn's life in battle more than once, had earned him his position in the group. Gall MacMorna had initially led the Fianna after he killed Fionn's father in battle many years back, and at Cormac's request he had been included within the Fiann. Ilbroch and Diarmid made up the balance of the Fiann, Ilbroch having saved Oisin's life during a boar attack while hunting in the Wicklow Mountains, and Diarmid for his prowess in battle, having been the hero of many campaigns in the southwest. The 6 members of the Fiann were given seats at the head table with Cormac, Fionn sitting to Cormac's immediate right. Caoilte was seated next to Fionn, then Oisin, Ilbroch, Gall, and Diarmid at the end of the table. To the left of the king was Dunling, Ilbroch's father, and a lifelong friend of Cormac's. An empty chair for his daughter, Gráinne, and then the golden chair left vacant for the goddess Danu, as was tradition should she choose to attend. At less prestigious tables throughout the Great Hall, members of the Fianna and officers from both the King's Guard and Leinster army sat intermingled and partook of the generous supply of food and drink on hand. The evening began with the retelling of the victorious battle over the Norse by Caoilte, poet and storyteller of the Fianna. At appropriate moments there was applause from the King's court, and some at the head of the table, and occasionally even Cormac himself. At the end of the storytelling, Caoilte sat back down, and Cormac rose to toast his victorious Fianna. Though only 10 years older than the Fianna leader, Cormac looked much older. His long grey beard and weather-beaten face projected a countenance more of a druid than a king, and except for his royal garb and the golden crown on his head, he might well have been mistaken for one. He thanked his good friend Dunling and praised the army of the King of Leinster, and acknowledged their part in the victory that they shared. "Men of Ireland," Cormac then called out, "we gather here this day specifically to honour Fionn and his mighty Fianna. Let us now stand and raise our goblets. Sláinte, Fionn." The hall rang out with loud applause and the roar of fighting men that were clearly in a less sober of moods. As the cheers subsided, the heavy drape that screened the entrance to the main hall parted to the melodic strains of a quartet of harps. 8 young dancers gracefully made their way into the hall, spreading rose petals to the floor as they approached the head table. "Now I present my daughter, Grania," Cormac roared. The drapes split open fully, and the king's daughter joined the maidens in the Dance of the Veils before the gathering. At the music's end, she fell breathlessly to the floor before her father, amidst much applause and cheering. Her father rose once more and put his arm onto Fionn's shoulder. "Fionn, in honour of your loyalty and in appreciation of the years of service to this crown, I give you my daughter as your wife. Take her and treat her well, for even the bravest and strongest of warriors needs the love of a good woman." Fionn stood up and accepted Cormac's offer. He praised him for his wisdom and kindness. "In the last 1,000 years," he said, "Ireland hasn't known peace or prosperity as it now enjoys under your reign, my liege." While all the speeches were being uttered, Grania still lay head stooped at the front of the table. She peered from behind the locks of hair, which hung freely to the floor, at the handsome figure of Diarmid at the end of the table. How unfair, she thought, that my love is to be traded as a token of appreciation to a man old enough to be my father, and meanwhile there's a handsome young warrior that's by far a better match. Fionn came to her, and taking her hand, he escorted her back to her chair, where she could now enjoy the remainder of the festivities. But as the evening wore on, Grania spoke to her servant maid, and instructed her to put a sleeping potion in all but 2 goblets, and deliver one to her and the other to the handsome young man at the far end of the table. And so it was that as time passed, so too did the volume level of the festivities get lower. No one really noticed, because it wasn't unusual at a time of high spirits with a crowd like that many would drink themselves into a standstill. By the time the last head hit the table, Grania was already sitting close to Diarmid, engaged in conversation. "And so, Diarmid, what are your thoughts?" she asked. "Do we allow love to naturally take place between man and wife, or use the bonding of a man and wife as a token or gesture?" It was at this moment that Diarmid realised that he and Grania seemed to be the only 2 at the table who were still awake. Yes, the guards were also still awake and attentively watching over the security of the proceedings, but they too were unsurprised at the level of revellers that had apparently drunk themselves to sleep. "What's going on?" he hissed at her. "What have you done to Cormac and his court?" He looked intensely at Grania. Grania leaned in closer to him and spoke in a voice that only he would hear. "Diarmid, I must know the answer to my question. Should we seek love—" "What's this talk of love?" Diarmid interrupted. "What have you done, woman, to spread poison into the stomachs of my lord and the noble Fianna?" "They're only sleeping," Grania answered dismissively. "Diarmid, this is our moment. It's not a time to be faint of heart. Can't you see that the person meant for you has been frivolously promised to one older than her father? You must take me away from here. Let's go. I've given instructions for the horses to be made ready, and we need to leave now." "Lady, I cannot take you away," he said. "You're promised not just to another, but to Fionn McCool, leader of the Fianna and friend to me and mine. There is no honour in stealth, and I will not be party to this plan. Surely you must come to your senses." Grania stared closer into his eyes. "There is no honour in love lost, and I challenge you, Diarmid, to stand as a man. No, stand as a warrior to claim a woman that should be yours. You know I'm right, Diarmid." "I cannot." Diarmid hung his head and looked away. "For if you do not take me away tonight, then I swear to the gods that I will finish this wasted life as we speak." Grania reached to the table and took the dagger from Diarmid's plate and held the point to her chest. "Woman, come to your senses," he whispered, and leaned towards her again. "This is all that makes sense," she answered. "Will you take me away now, or do I finish this moment for good myself? Will you accept this maiden's geas?" Diarmid knew full well the meaning of such a commitment, and so he continued to try to reason with her. "Grania," Diarmid spoke softly now, "even if we did run from Tara, how far do you think we'd get? Fionn would track us to the ends of the world. He would move mountains and earth to get you back, and to wreak revenge. I don't know of any warrior in this country who could meet Fionn in combat and survive." "Then I must die because you're afraid of Fionn McCool, and afraid to take this chance that has been put before you," she sobbed. "Have a good life, Diarmid O'Dina," and tears now rolled freely from her eyes. She pressed the dagger harder against her breast, and blood began to trickle as her soft white skin yielded to the pressing blade. Diarmid grabbed her wrist and took the dagger from her hand. "Grania, though it saddens me deeply to cause the wrath of Fionn and to bring disgrace upon my family, I cannot stand by and watch you end your life this way. Okay, Let's find the horses and make haste. We'll need as much of a head start as your sleeping potion will give us. Diarmid woke abruptly from his sleep-like trance to the sound of horses' hoofs closing fast. "Grania, wake up," he whispered harshly. "Wake, they're upon us." Grania gathered herself to her feet as one who had just awoken from a deep sleep, and she stepped partly behind Diarmid and pressed her body into his back. For his part, Diarmid was now standing, sword drawn and battle-ready, facing the directions that the horses were approaching from. "Who goes there?" he shouted, as the horses broke through the woods and into the clearing where they stood. Grania now clung to his side, face ashen with fear. 2 horses broke into view, and Diarmid looked behind them for others. "Diarmid, it's me, Maelchan," shouted the first rider to approach, and he pulled to a halt just feet from where Diarmid and Grania stood. Maelchan had none of the handsome features of his older brother, and only the sword by his side and shield on the saddle bore witness to this being a warrior at all. His eyes seemed too close together, and his pointed facial features gave him more the appearance of some creature rather than a human. "I'm here to warn you that you must leave now. Fionn is closing in, and scarcely more than minutes behind." He explained to Diarmid the direction that Fionn was coming from, and how they may have only 10 or 15 minutes before he would be upon them. Grania hugged tighter into Diarmid. This was the closest that she had come to Fionn since the chase began, and she could feel the hair on the nape of her neck stand on end. "You have to leave now," Maelchan stressed. "We've been sent by Gowl to get you away to safety. Ride now." Diarmid went to the side of Maelchan's horse and extended his hand in gratitude. "Many thanks," he said. "I will repay Gowl's friendship. Tell him I said so." Grania retrieved their horses and was now walking briskly towards Diarmid, reins in hand. "Come, Diarmid, let's get out of here," she said, as she pulled close. Maelchan and Manor pulled their horses around and rode back into the woods whence they had came. As Grania mounted, Diarmid kicked some dirt onto the embers, hoping to throw off any scouts looking to find out how far they were ahead. But just before he mounted his horse, Grania noticed him take 2 straight pieces of twig and lay them side by side a foot or so away from the fire. As he climbed onto the saddle, they pointed their horses south. "We should make it to Dangan tomorrow," he said, as they rode off. "My father's house will be a welcome sight."